Hey there knitters, welcome to episode 27 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about my best tips and tricks for fit on socks and how to care for your socks so that you get the most wear out of them. And the first thing we're going to talk about when it comes to socks is swatching. I know a lot of folks don't get very excited about swatching, and I will share a dirty little secret that I have with you about swatching a little bit later on. But we need to look at swatching for socks because unlike a scarf or a shawl that doesn't have to match gauge, it can sort of just drape or wrap around you, socks have to fit, right? Kind of like a sweater. You don't want them to be baggy, you don't want them to be hard to get onto. So we're going to look at the best practice for swatching and why it matters. So your best practice for knitting a swatch for your socks is to knit it exactly the same way you're going to knit your actual socks, which means a small circumference in the round using the method that you're going to use for your socks. So if you are a magic loop sock knitter, you're going to knit your sock using the magic loop method. If you use DPNs or 2 circulars or even one of those really small circular needles, that's exactly how you want to knit your swatch. As for how many stitches to cast on for a swatch, it's a little bit dependent on what the fabric is that your swatch is going to have. If you're knitting something like a stockinette swatch where you're simply knitting around and around and around, I usually cast on around 60 stitches. This is slightly less or slightly more than most sock patterns call for their smallest size. Most sock patterns fall between 56 and 64 stitches for an adult size sock. 60 stitches allows you to lay your swatch flat once it's blocked and measure a good distance over the sock so you can extrapolate your gauge. You want to be able to measure about 2 inches across your swatch, horizontally for your stitch gauge and vertically for your row gauge. So not only is knowing your stitch gauge really critical for making sure that you end up with a sock that fits around the circumference of your foot the right way, but knowing your stitch gauge is also really critical. If we take a look at a standard sock here, if you're knitting from the toe up to the cuff, your stitch gauge is going to help you determine where you need to stop knitting so that your heel ends up the right length. Conversely, if you're knitting from the top down, your stitch gauge is going to tell you where you have to stop knitting the toe or the foot of your sock before you start the toe so that it ends up the right length. Okay, so here's my dirty little secret about swatching. Don't tell anybody. I am so used to knitting socks now that I know how many stitches I need to cast on for a sock for my feet. Basically, I know what my gauge is at this point. And I will use the sock that I'm knitting to determine my row gauge without knitting a swatch. In my experience, because we're knitting at such a dense gauge, and this is not true of garments, okay? Please do not apply this to garments. This is just for socks. Because we're knitting at such a dense gauge, we don't get a ton of growth on our sock between when you're knitting it and after it's been blocked. You might get half a stitch or a full stitch of growth, and the same with rows. You might get half a row of growth or 1 row of growth, but it's not, in my experience, enough to have swatched. I do swatch for socks where there are really intricate stitch patterns, lots of cables, things that are really going to impact what my standard stockinette stitch gauge would be. But when it comes to just knitting a sock and determining what my row gauge is, I don't swatch. With that said, I do not consider that best practices, and I would not encourage that for you unless you are a very avid sock knitter and you already know your gauge. In that case, you may not even want to or need to be watching this video. But I just want to let you know that I am human too, and there are times where I don't love to swatch, especially for socks. So I think the really critical part about today's video that I wanted to share that when I started knitting socks was really hard information to find is the right fit for socks. So what I'm going to share with you now are sort of generalizations that I have learned to make my socks fit the best, in the hopes that it will help you make socks that fit you the best. So when it comes to choosing a size for your socks, there's negative ease that needs to be taken into account, as well as what I think of as negative length. But you could also say it's negative ease, I suppose. So when it comes to choosing a finished size for your sock, my best practice is to choose a sock that is 1 inch smaller than your foot circumference, which means it would have 1 inch of negative ease. So for example, I have a sock I have a foot when I measure around the circumference at the widest point of 8.5 inches in circumference, which means I want to look for a sock that has a finished circumference of 7.5 inches. Now, not every sock pattern is going to give me that exact amount of ease, right? Every designer's gauge is a little bit different. Every stitch pattern has a little bit more or less flexibility to it. So you can look for a sock that is anywhere between 0 inches of ease, basically meaning it's exactly the same size as your foot, and up to 1 inch of negative ease, basically meaning it's 1 inch smaller than the size of your foot. So if I'm doing color work, for example, and I've got floats, I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek because I don't knit a lot of color work, but the odd time I have worked a color work sock, I tend to look for slightly less ease, because with the floats, I find that the fabric is less stretchy. So the more stretch that your sock has, like a stockinette stitch, the more ease your foot will tolerate. So you can go up to 1 inch. The less stretch a fabric has, say lots of cables or color work with stranding where you may not have the flexibility, you'll want to look for slightly less ease. Now, when it comes to determining the negative ease for the length of your foot, it's really important that you take this into account, because a fitted sock will last you longer. A sock that is loose and therefore has a lot more friction between your foot and the sole of your shoe, because it's looser, will often break down a lot more quickly. So you want to have a sock that fits not only tight around your foot, but also lengthwise across your foot. So over the years, I have found a few formulas that have worked for me in terms of determining the length of my sock that I want to knit, and it has to do with the construction of the heel. So for a heel flap sock, meaning you're going to be working this portion of the sock flat, and then you shape it out into your foot, I use 10% negative ease, or 10% negative length. Basically meaning that the total length of the sock from the back of the heel, that's this bottom point here where the heel flap ends, to the tip of the toe where I graft the sock closed, is 10% shorter than my actual foot measurement. So the really simple calculation to figure this out is to measure your foot from the back of your heel to the tip of your longest toe and multiply it by 0.9. 0.9 is simply 90%. And so that means that when I knit a sock from the back of the heel to the tip of my toe, it's 8.1 inches long instead of 9. So I now have 2 sets of negative ease applied to my sock. I have 1 inch negative ease around my sock and 10% negative ease in the length of my sock. So my sock is shorter than my actual foot. When I am knitting socks with a short row heel, meaning that the entire sock is constructed and you work short rows just in here to shape this curve, I apply the same formula. I use 10% negative ease in the length of the sock, or 10% negative length. I don't know why that's hard to say. Now, when it comes to the Flegel heel method, which is worked by increasing along an edge and then working the shaping on the bottom of the foot, I use a different percentage method. I use 15% negative ease. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know exactly why the difference in percentage works for the Flegel heel. I suspect it has something to do with the structure of the back of the sock. It's a little bit stretchier than a heel flap method, which generally has slipped stitches worked into it, so you get kind of a corrugated fabric, so it's denser, but it also stretches less. I think that's why it works. So just to sort of wrap all of that up, what I want to say is you want to have negative ease in your circumference, somewhere between 0 and 1 inch of negative ease. When it comes to the length of your sock, you want to have between 10 and 15% negative length. My best tips, again, are for a heel flap or a short row sock, 10% negative length. For a Fleegle heel, I definitely recommend the 15% negative length. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about caring for your socks once you've knit them. We know a lot of time actually goes into knitting socks. I had someone ask me once how long it actually takes me. And so I actually set a timer while I knit a pair of socks once. And it takes me about 10 hours to knit one pair of socks. Now, keep in mind that I'm knitting those from my head. That's a standard stockinette stitch sock where there's no patterning to it. This is all the yarn doing the striping. I didn't add that in. And I also have pretty small feet. I wear a women's 6 or 6.5. But they're a big time investment. So when you've done all of that work, you want to make sure that you care for them well so they last you the longest without having to need repairs. So one of the things that is really popular on social media are sock blockers. And I love them. They look beautiful. Not only are they an excellent way of displaying your socks, but they look great in photos. But my unpopular opinion is that they are good basically for photos or presentation only. They're not realistic if you are blocking your socks on a regular basis, especially if you have more than one pair, unless you have a lot of sock blockers, in which case I'm very jealous. I have two pairs, or 2 sets? Yeah, I have 4 sock blockers. I can block 4 socks on blockers. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is sock blockers make your socks look excellent. They fit inside your form of your sock, which naturally, if you take it out off the form, look a little bit weird, right? But they do a couple of things. One thing is they prolong drying time. So your socks that you already just want to finish drying and put back on your feet take longer. But they also stretch out the fibers of your socks more than you probably want to on a regular wearing basis. So when you're wearing your socks, we compress the fibers on the sole of the foot just by stepping on them, and at the back of the heel. Generally, if you're not wearing any shoes over your socks, that's a moot point. But if you have them in shoes or boots, you're compressing the fibers at the back of your heel against the back of your shoe. Compressed fibers have less flexibility and are therefore more prone to breakage. So you want your fibers to be as fluffy and unstretched as they can be. So when it comes to washing your socks, I think the best practice is to put them in the wash with your wool wash, gently squeeze them out, and simply lay them flat to dry. They won't look nice. They're not necessarily going to be Instagram ready, but they're going to fit your feet better when you put them on, and they're going to last longer for the lifetime of your socks. And that brings me to my second point. Wash your socks in between each wearing. Of course, if you've only put them on for, say, an hour at the end of the night because your toes are cold, that's probably less of an issue. But wool fibers are notoriously strong. They are odor resistant. And so a lot of people, for example, will wear a sweater multiple times between washing it. But a sweater doesn't take on the same wear and tear that a pair of socks does inside our shoes. So by washing your socks between each wear, it allows the fibers to fluff back up, build up that elasticity again so that when you put them on the next time, they're ready for the abuse that we're going to put them through on that day. Okay, that's where we're going to wrap it up for today, folks. I have been mulling over the idea of creating a socks sort of master class, though. Is that something that you would be interested in? I would love to hear from you in the comments whether you think a sock masterclass would be something that you would enjoy. It would not be free. It would be something that I would offer as a one-on-one sort of limited participation. But it would be, I think I would keep it under $20 because I want to make it accessible to folks. But basically what it would allow us to do is take a sock pattern, and I can offer two versions, one with a heel flap method that I love so much, or one with a Flegel heel method, another one that I love so much because they're excellent for people with high insteps. And we would maybe take 3 or 4 weeks to go through the steps all the way from selecting yarn, measuring our feet, swatching, and then determining how to best make the socks fit us with what the information is in the pattern. So let me know what you think about that. I think that might be fun, but I also know it's a busy time of year, and we are, believe it or not, rolling into the holiday season. So let me know what you think. If that's something you'd like to invest in to kind of up your sock game, I would love to hear from you. Next week, we are going to talk about what to do if your stitch gauge matches a pattern, but your row gauge doesn't. This is something that doesn't get talked about when you're a new knitter, and I think there's a lot of misinformation that we can correct out there. Thank you so much for being here, folks. I really enjoyed spending some time with you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and as always, I wish you happy knitting.